Mascot Horror has cemented itself as an exciting new offshoot of the classic genre, with games and soon movies like Poppy Playtime, Baldi's Basics, and Garten of BanBan raking in millions of views and dollars. But are these games and films substantial pieces of art like their contemporaries, and is it okay that developers and producers are targeting these properties primarily at children? The truth is, Mascot Horror plays a far more important role in the horror genre than people realize, and it's not for the reason you're expecting. Now, I'm sure most of you are young enough to know what Mascot Horror is, but for the staggering 10% of you who are over 45, first of all, book yourself in a colonoscopy, it could save your f***ing life, and second of all, here's the basic rundown. According to TVTropes.com, Mascot Horror is a subgenre generally inspired by classic slasher media. Where the subgenre differs though is in the nature of these killers. Instead of your Jasons, your Michaels, your Freddys, you've got twisted, evil renditions of classic childhood symbols. Your Baldis, your BanBans, and your Freddys. But of course, Scott Cawthon's brainchild Five Nights at Freddy's undeniably spawned the subgenre in the form we see it today. From my point of view, that influence comes down to two key attributes. The first of those being that the game's true horror is largely implied and thematic, hidden in cryptic lore and atmospheric elements. And the second, which I would argue is a product of the first, being that the game's primary audience, intentional or not, is young children. This is where a lot of people's dislike of Mascot Horror begins and ends. The fact that the games are, at least on the surface level, thin of any real artistic meaning, and that they're enjoyed predominantly by little kids. Because Terrifier 2 is really bringing some deep social commentary to the horror genre, isn't it? With all of this known about Mascot Horror's characteristics, the subgenre remains absurdly successful, but should we accept that? Well, buckle in, grab some snacks, a drink, your cat, your dog, your Kmart branded knockoff hoodie, and get comfortable, because we're going back to the beginning. Chapter 1. Early Written Language, 3100 BCE. Nah, I'm just kidding, but we do have to go back to when the Western world wanted to control everything about women. Where's the cut? Before his career peaked in Hotel Transylvania, Dracula, in the book of the same name by Bram Stoker, was a symbol of large, looming societal concerns latent in Victorian England. The Count himself represented the fear of subversive foreigners, ungodly men exerting their demonic influence upon the righteous English populace. Lucy Westenra, the beautiful blonde bachelorette, has 3 suitors, and although she devotes herself to one, the mere thought of marrying all of them crosses her mind. So of course she's the one who ends up becoming a vampire, attacks a bunch of children, and tries to jump her fiance's veins before Van Helsing f***ing decapitates her. Listen, I'm sorry for the spoilers, but this shit came out like 200 years ago. Of course, this fear of foreigners and the new woman is mostly subtextual, but it's clearly there. Given that Dracula is one of the most influential works of horror fiction ever created, these subtextual principles would be carried forth into the future of the genre. It's part of the reason why we have films like last year's Talk to Me by the Raka Raka Boys. In that film, the possessed embalmed hand and its effects can be interpreted as a metaphor for drug abuse, and it's not a coincidence that the film was released amid the worst opioid crisis in the history of the United States and surging illicit drug use in Australia. Equally but amusingly less subtly, films like Megan and Afraid encapsulate the new fear of artificial intelligence and its possible ramifications for our future. Good art examines some facet of the human condition, and for horror media, that facet is, shockingly, our fears and concerns. So, what is Mascot Horror concerned with? Well, from my research, I've found one that seems to unite many of the subgenre's properties, and Religion Unplugged writer Joseph Holmes hits it right on the head. In his article about the recent Five Nights at Freddy's film, he outlines a pervasive fear of replacement, contending that with or without AI, humans are doomed to replace people we're supposed to love. This presents itself in the film with Mike's search for answers pertaining to his dead brother's disappearance. His devotion to this cause essentially replaces his relationship with Gabby, his living younger sister. And of course, we can't forget how antagonist Afton literally murders children and replaces them with animatronics. This fear of replacement works on a metatextual level as well. This film, as well as many other Mascot Horror properties, incorporates some element of nostalgia, which traditionally is a rosy, bittersweet feeling. However, the recontextualization of the things we are nostalgic for, i.e. the golden days of family entertainment businesses like Chuck E. Cheese, into something more sinister, replaces those warm feelings with something new and terrifying. How does this translate across other Mascot Horror games and films? Well, a Poppy Playtime fan theory posits that the founder of Playtime Co. takes his dead adopted daughter and revives her in a Poppy doll, replacing her with a twisted, tortured puppet. Further on in the game's lore timeline, even more children are experimented on and replaced with the giant living toys we see in the game. Why? To cut costs that would be spent on human workers for the company. Looking at Garten of BanBan, a pattern begins to emerge. An imposing facility housing terrible experiments replaces the sweet collaborative environment of a kindergarten. And why were BanBan and the other creatures created? No less than with the goal of cutting costs and replacing human kindergarten carers with these new mascots. These examples help us deepen our understanding of this ubiquitous fear of replacement. We can thus conclude that it is made up of the following two concerns. The rise of the internet has platformed countless bad actors to use characters and properties popular with children for nefarious purposes. I only need to mention Elsagate to conjure in your mind disgusting images of how this is happening to this day. And with a generation of children being raised more by iPads than their parents, it's rational to be concerned about what ramifications replacing those fundamental human connections will have. Given the weight of these concerns, we can comfortably place Mascot Horror alongside other horror subgenres on the grounds of substance. There are relevant topical ideas imbued into these games that might not present themselves on the surface, but nevertheless provide thought-provoking and engaging opportunities for analysis. But with that said, who cares if these stories are layered if all that meaningful commentary is lost on an audience of children? And that entire question depends on whether or not content designed specifically to incite fear and terror should even be targeted at children. It comes down to the age-old debate of what kind of content children should and shouldn't consume. Research has well established that young people exposed to content unintended for their age group are more anxious, aggressive, and presenting of antisocial behavior. Why is this? Because kids are information sponges. They're constantly learning, holding on to everything they're shown and told unless one piece of information happens to contradict the other. I thought India and Indonesia were the same country until the ripe old age of 13, simply because no one had told me otherwise, and through my knowledge of conjunctions and slang in the English language, I concluded that India was a shortening of Indonesia. Like, it's a pretty f***ing stupid thing to think, but can you really blame me? This is the reason classification boards like the ESRB and MPAA exist, because showing children certain things can and will alter their brain chemistry. And even though lots of people pay them as much mind as BMW drivers pay their indicators, these age classification logos inform parents of what they generally should and shouldn't be showing their kids. Poppy Playtime and lots of other Mascot Horror games are rated teen by the ESRB. In Australia, the equivalent for this is M for mature. It's basically the MPAA's PG-13. The official guideline states that the content is, and I quote, not recommended for people under 15. On the whole, I believe age classification systems and other forms of age-gating children's content are necessary and beneficial, but my concern doesn't lie there. Instead, it's related to the sparsely researched effects of overbearing restrictions on what children are consuming. In my research, I found a single study written by the University of London's David Buckingham that even remotely touches on this. Buckingham cites findings from two French researchers in 2001 that showed how the more children used the internet, the more confident they became with their ability to cope with dangerous material. They became media literate. Furthermore, his own research cements that some children positively reject content they deemed too old for them, but resisted or rejected their parents' attempts to decide that for them. This shows how children's drives and their parents' wishes often collide. Buckingham states that the way forward for media literacy is through open discussion and engagement with risks, rather than censorship. I tend to agree, because all censorship ever did for me, when I was a 10-year-old boy with a brand new iPad, was make me want to seek out the content being hidden from me even more. This is actually a common psychological response called reactance. A good example of reactance in action is the don't think of a pink elephant example. You're gonna do exactly that because I just told you not to. It's why teens are so rebellious and why adults are so susceptible to conspiracy theories. When you present information as being hazardous to possess, it only makes it more enticing to learn. Look, I don't blame my parents for wanting to protect me from the internet at an early age. They were completely reasonable knowing what kind of things are a simple search away. But being told I shouldn't watch certain things only made me want to watch them more, want to seek out even scarier content. And where did my search lead me? To what's probably a universal experience for Gen Z. The Bud Dwyer tapes, where a man puts a gun in his mouth and pulls the trigger on live TV. I remember having nightmares for days after seeing it. It terrified me, and of course it did. I wouldn't even watch that video now, 9 years later. But my curiosity for the morbid would eventually be fed, and with the approval of my parents too, by Five Nights at Freddy's. I got to chase that adrenalizing feeling of fear, and through MatPat's lore videos dive into a thematically rich story. After this, I was able to recognize when something might be too scary for me. I didn't seek out gore videos anymore because my needs were met, and I understood what it was I was looking at. Those children who decided certain content was too old for them would never have been able to do that if they weren't exposed to confronting content and had learned from those experiences. This is the hugely important role that Mascot Horror occupies. While less scary than normal horror content, its properties still have an edge, allowing it to function as a perfect entry point for children to begin exposing themselves to confronting content through. With this, they can develop the extremely important skills of media literacy and start engaging with the deeper themes and concerns of the Mascot Horror subgenre. Mascot horror transcends being a simple horror subgenre. Instead, it stands as a vital and hugely entertaining learning opportunity. And a fucking profitable one at that. Holy sh**. Buckingham cites findings from 2 French researchers in 2001. I got 1 and 2.